Friday news before the final sprint weekend of the season. The last test at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix of F1's new qualifying format will take place, but we do of course know already that there are going to be 6 races next year with the same format. But there's plenty of news to get into before all of the action starts on track this Friday evening here at GPFans. And we're talking qualifying, but perhaps not sprint qualifying, as George Russell says that the tyre structure in qualifying needs a revamp, and elsewhere Valtteri Bottas is confirming what many of us thought, that his new long-year deal with Alfa Romeo is making him a far more relaxed man behind the wheel of his Mercedes. I'm Ollie Wilson, this is GPFans. You should be subscribing down below to stay up to date with all of the news and views from around the world of Formula 1 with us as we reach the climax of this emphatic season. And now let's get into Friday's headlines before all the action. Valtteri Bottas has confirmed what many of us thought anyway, revealing his recent streak of form is in part due to the freedom offered by his multi-year deal with Alfa Romeo. The Finn was announced as Kimi Raikkonen's replacement at Alfa Romeo for 2022 earlier this year, just ahead of the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, a race weekend that saw Bottas take pole in Friday's qualifying session and finish first in Saturday's sprint. Since then, he has ruled the roost in Turkey and took pole in Mexico in perhaps one of his best streaks of form in Formula 1 since he joined Mercedes. This might be because since his arrival at the Silver Arrows, he's never had more than a one-year deal, but since sealing his long-term future elsewhere, the Finn feels more free behind the wheel in F1. It probably had a bigger effect on me than I thought, said Bottas when asked about his deal with Alfa Romeo and the impact it's had on him. Once everything was done and I knew what I was going to do for the next few years, I felt, more like freedom and less pressure in a way, like a weight lifted off my shoulders. That was the feeling. It is something I have never had before, that I know that actually I can focus on something with the team, with me, for a few years ahead, not just focusing on 1 year. Now that he feels more content with the ability to plan for the future, the Mercedes driver has reflected that such contracts of 1 year or so just don't work in Formula 1. On whether it got harder throughout his stint at Mercedes and perhaps the pressure of a short-term contract was a distraction, Bottas explained it does. Again, everyone is individual with how they cope with pressure and which kind of pressure and what kind of length of the pressure. But for me, 5 years in that similar situation, never being able to think for longer than 6 months, it doesn't work. It was definitely easier in the beginning, even though there was always still discussions every year over who was going to be in the seat, which was a distraction. And don't forget, it was a pretty similar thing for me with Williams, more or less. There were always options in the contract, so basically it has been 9 years, always, not being able to focus long term. Now it is time for that, so I am happy. Elsewhere, George Russell wants to see a change in Formula 1's tyre regulations around qualifying, as he feels the current rules are only seeing the rich get richer. The British driver, who will be joining the so-called rich next season at Mercedes, feels the current regulations as they stand aid the elite in the sport rather than allowing those in the middle of the F1 pack a greater chance to compete. At the moment, the top 10 drivers are obliged to start a Grand Prix on the set of tyres used to set their fastest lap in Q2, as we all know. This often sees drivers competing on the cusp of elimination progressing on a set of soft tyres that often compromises the strategy for the race, while the faster cars progress on perhaps the medium Pirellis. F1 Managing Director of Motorsports Ross Brawn suggested the regulation could be discussed for the future, something Grand Prix Drivers Association Director Russell agrees with. I think that would be wise, because I guess the rich would just get richer and the poor poorer when the fastest cars have the pace to get through to Q3 on a harder compound, said Russell. I think when the cars in the midfield don't have the opportunity to fight, the game is already over, so I think that would just make things easier for everybody. Now, AlphaTauri driver Pierre Gasly has said in agreement with Russell, "I completely agree. We actually have been in that situation a couple of times where you don't really have the pace to make it, or it is very tight, and you need to go with the softer compound. If you do make it, you know that you are going to compromise your race. It just increases the gap between the top teams and the midfield when you are right on the edge of making Q3. So I obviously agree with George's comments. So a shake-up in Formula 1 qualifying might be needed, and for once we aren't talking about the sprint races, which is a bit of a novelty, although that will be taking place this weekend, of course, in Brazil, with regular qualifying coming up later on this Friday evening. But do you agree with George and Pierre Gasly's comments that perhaps the tyre structure in Formula 1 qualifying needs a revamp as well? Let us know in the comments section below. Of course, give us your thoughts as well on the upcoming Brazilian Grand Prix, and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with everything we do here at GPFans.